All right. Hey, folks. So we are going into a Q&A episode. These questions are coming in from my YouTube and also my Instagram. So there's quite a few. So let's crack on. I will try and timestamp these so you guys can navigate to the right question. So first of all, Adam Mangione, what do you think of Greg's Maingaining approach compared to a lean bulk? Okay, so I am familiar with Greg Doucette now. I've started following him fairly recently, and his Maingaining approach is actually quite similar to what I recommend with my recomposition. So let's look at the context for who this is possibly not for. Okay, firstly, before we talk about recomp, I would say recomp is not for possibly a rank beginner who is particularly on the skinny side, because they are due to have their one big bulk where they just go up in weight 20, 30 pounds and gain some actual muscle tissue. And they understand the relationship between body weight, strength, growing muscle, all that good stuff, right? So for that person, possibly not ideal. The other side of things is if you are overly fat and you're relatively well trained, it's possibly not the best idea. Rather than recompositioning down, I would rather you should do a cut, get down to a reasonable body fat percentage, and then recomposition from there. So in one of my Instagram posts, by the way, if you're not following me, check me out on Instagram. I post interesting stuff there as well. On one of my Instagram posts, I talk about the helicopter model of fat loss. And that is this idea that when you're way up in the sky, you can come down fast. And being way up in the sky in a fat loss perspective is if you've got lots to lose. Right now, at a certain point, you'll encounter turbulence, and that's when you hit the clouds and it starts to get a bit shaky, right? And that, in the fat loss phase, is when it starts to get hard. Now, for those of you who have been 40, 50 or plus pounds overweight, you'll know what I mean, right? You'll have initial relatively fast fat loss, and then you'll hit a wall where you've got to change things up. That wall is generally when you want to slow things down. At that point, that's when you can forget the fast cuts. So assuming you're not a rank beginner who's skinny, and assuming you're not a trained individual who's overly fat, the Maingaining approach is pretty much what I recommend. Now, with Greg, he's not quite as precise with his instructions. I think he has followed up recently, but here's what I consider to be a true recomp. A true recomp is, let's say you're 15 to 20% body fat, which is still relatively lean, right? And within that, you're aiming to get down to, 12% or so over the course of the next year, perhaps. For that, you set up a recomp. Now, check out my video on recomp on exactly how to do that. But essentially, it's really just a very slow cut with all of the variables honed in. So like decent protein intake, calories just below maintenance across the week. It could be up and down throughout the week, but across the week is fine. And what's particularly important is you have to be able to demonstrate effective training. Now, that's really important. So I don't just mean you've got to have a good training program, because you can have any good training program, but it might not work if you just aren't executing it properly. So you've got to be able to demonstratively be improving. So over the course of that year, you have to have all of your variables dialed in and be adding weight to the bar in the gym on a monthly, weekly, regular basis for the duration of that time. And you absolutely can. If you're 20% body fat right now, you've got enough energy on your frame with a small deficit to build muscle and lose fat tissue at the same time. You definitely can do it. No. So yeah, the Maingaining approach is similar to that. Now, when you get down to the point where you're very lean, let's say you're 8% body fat coming out of a competition show, do I think recomposition is the way to go then? Not really. Lean bulk is possibly a way forward, because you've got to add calories in. You've got to be sensible about this. If there's no body fat to actually be there to be used for energy, then, well, you've got to add some calories in. So, but what I would say is once you're down to that body fat percentage of anywhere between, say, I guess 10 to 15%, you just want to keep it slow. You don't want to go too fast. You can possibly get away with faster cutting, but I would still keep the changes very slow in that 10 to 15 range. And that will give you the most benefit. But thing is, I do deal with a lot of people who are very, very overweight, and occasionally people who are very, very underweight. And so for those, more drastic cuts and bulks are warranted. But for the majority of people, you've got to think about what's going to happen after the diet as well. So if you have had a big fat loss transformation and you've come down 50 pounds and now you're in that range, well, are you still going to carry on your really strong cut right the way to the finish? Well, when you finish, then you may well have the possibility of rebounding at that stage. So I would say the end of your diet has got to look at least a little bit like what life will be like after the diet. That is a real key. And it's part of what I do with my coaching as well, is at the end of a cut, you've got to make sure that that person is set up for diet and life after the diet. So the end of your cut should start to approximate what your regular life will look like. And that's where the sort of Maingaining slow swings works best. So hopefully I've answered that question for you. Maingaining, yeah, it's good. I mean, I think having your calories roughly at the maintenance point for most people outside of the 2 examples that I gave is probably about right. Now, whether that level is slightly below or whether that level is slightly above is going to depend on whether you're closer to 10% or closer to 20%. There you go. Best way I can answer that. And yeah, I think that's clear. All right, next question from Tom. Would using double progression to go from early intermediate to advanced be enough, or more complicated periodization is required? Generally, yeah, this is where you want to introduce more complicated periodization. Yeah, I mean, double progression is not really periodization per se. It's just a method of progression. I don't know, I guess maybe we could argue that, but yeah, essentially, once you've got to the point where you can no longer progress linearly, then congratulations, you've got past the beginner stage. Like, great, like that's what you started in the gym for, well done. And at that point, that's when you got to be like, okay, let's now focus on looking at this in a bit more detail. Let's focus on what we can do. So I'll tell you my example. So when I was 22-ish, 23, I hit a wall, and I particularly remember it was the bench which was mostly troublesome for me. The squat and the deadlift was still moving up okay, and squat was actually pretty decent. I think I was squatting 160-ish, so 3.5 plates a side. What is it, like 350 pounds, something like that. My deadlift was 500. So my bench was really poor. It was 200 pounds, so 90 kilos, and I could never get above that. And so I messaged a guy called Dan John, who's still active right now. What a legend. I love the guy. And he messaged me back and he said, Faz, what I want you to do is look through your diaries and try and find some patterns in where you progress and get pulled back and progress and get pulled back. I was like, okay, I'll do that. I had no idea what he was talking about, because at this point, up until now, my education hadn't really touched on deloads. In fact, no one was really talking about deloads at the time, but Dan sort of trained in them. I'm not sure he ever really, that early on, he had not really discussed it, but he's told me to have a look at the pattern. So I did. And I found that every 3rd week, I would just fall apart. I would get a cold. I would get an injury. Something would happen every 3rd week, as often as that, every 3 weeks. And so I wrote back to Danny. He's like, great. Okay, you found the pattern. I was like, okay. So then what I started to do was I started to train hard for 2 weeks, and I would deload the 3rd week. And bear in mind, at this point, there was nothing on the internet about this, like very little about like deloads. People used to call them unloading weeks and stuff like that. Like really weird stuff. The terminology wasn't set yet. It was that new. So there wasn't any information I could find on deloads. I just had what Dan had told me, and what I had found in my logs was something happens every 3rd week. So I would train hard for 2 weeks, and then 3rd week I would have a Liza Light week. And people thought I was nuts. People thought this was like stupid, because they're like, Faz, you're basically resting for a 1/3 of your training life. And I was like, well, it's working. So it worked really, really well. And that was what led to my eventual 300 plus bench and 500 plus squat back in like 2004, 2005. The video's on this channel of the squat anyway. So yeah, at some point you will need more complex periodization, and double progression won't be enough. You'll know when that happens, when you're doing everything else right, because at that stage I had tried everything else. My diet was top notch. I had been gaining weight. It was fine. Just something kept going wrong and it would put me out. So yeah, that was when I needed something more complicated. And it could be as simple as a deload weeks. It could be waiving workload. That was very popular. At the time, there was a lot of stuff on like Russian periodization, which was high weeks, low weeks, high weeks, low weeks. So you'd never really deload. You just wave it over the across the month. So yeah, at some point you are going to need more complicated periodization, but periodization doesn't have to be like insanely complicated. It can literally just be a premeditated light week and then going heavy again. When I went straight back into the 2 weeks, I went straight back into PR that first 2 weeks. I didn't, build up or anything, but you could implement maybe a light week, an intro week, and then 2 heavy weeks, something like that. But keep it simple. Just do enough periodization that it will spur on results, and no more than that. So you don't need to go from no periodization, linear progression, to just like a complicated Russian model. So Keep it simple. Just do enough to get your results. All right, next question is combining cardio like running, cycling, 1 or 2 or even 3 times a week combined with training legs. How would you program that? It's actually really simple. And what we need to look at is what is the minimum you need for progression for both activities you're trying to progress. And I'll answer this in running and legs, but I'll also cover this on everything, so sports training as well. So we know that the minimum you need for strength progression is about once a week. Okay, once a week for as low as, I don't know, 1 set has demonstrated progress in the research. Now, you might need more than that, but then that's where the next question comes into play. What is the minimum you need for cardiovascular development? Well, again, we know from the research, roughly 3 times a week is very beneficial for continuing cardiovascular work. Now, do you need 3 times a week? Well, I could progress on cardio twice a week because I'm not very good at cardio, right? But let's say you are a relatively advanced or intermediate cardiovascular person, whatever. You may well need 3 times a week to progress. Once you're past the beginner stage, then, again, similar to lifting weights, you get to a point where you need at least 3 times a week for continued aerobic cardiovascular improvements. And we know that from the research. It's relatively well established at this point. Now, so we know that, okay, you can do some type of cardiovascular ability. It doesn't have to be running, the same thing, but it can be a variety of cardiovascular ability, cardiovascular exercise 3 times a week, followed by something to do with your legs at least once a week. So I would just have separate days for that. You've got there minimum 4 training days, once a week on legs, and then 3 times a week on running. Pretty easy to do. And that's how I program it. And I guess nowadays people call it concurrent training, where you're training for 2 goals at the same time. My best piece of advice for you on that, no matter how you program it, I mean, I've given you an example there, 4 days a week. It's not really that important. But no matter how you do this, all I would say to you is the most important thing is this. Don't mix the goals in the same activity. All right? So one of the popular examples that I always use is boxers who use punching dumbbells and punch with dumbbells. It is the most mind-numbingly stupid thing I have seen, and I will continue to see, because all it does is it teaches the boxer how to punch slowly, and it's really poor weightlifting exercise, so it doesn't actually build any muscle, so or any strength. So it is literally the most waste of time ever in a boxer's arsenal. What that boxer should be doing is specific cardiovascular work and then specific strength training work to get the best of both training modalities. If you mix, something great and something great, when you turn it into, people think, oh, I'm going to turn it into something double great. No, you just end up with just crap. So don't mix the activities together in one Frankenstein activity, all right? You'll end up with some weird Joel Seedman stuff at that point. We don't do that around here. So that's all I would say. With mixing it is not a problem. Like, it's fine. People do it all the time. There's no cardio really until it gets very excessive that's going to impact your weight training. Just you can eat around it. Just make sure you're trying to space things out as much as possible. Pay attention to your recovery. Try and do the minimums. See what your minimum is that you need to progress. I think that's a very useful activity when it comes to trying to do concurrent training. Have a look at what is the minimum you need to actually progress, and then use that amount. Like, now at the moment, I'm currently doing 3 or 4 days of lifting weights and about 3 days of cardio. For me, that's quite a good amount to progress on all the things I need to progress on within the context of my lifestyle, which a lot of it involves sitting on this chair, right? So that's okay for me. For you, you might not have as much time. You might not need as much activity. You might be more active outside of the gym. You might have a physical job, for example, whatever. Okay, but try and find the minimum you need to progress. Start with that and then progress after when you stall, but not just because you have an idea that you want to train, legs 3 times a week because that's how many times you used to train it before and make progress. Well, why don't you try once, see if you can progress on that, and then try running 3 times, see if you can, try a cardiovascular ability 3 times, see if you can progress on that. Start with the minimum and go from there. All right, next question is, I've been training for a year now and I've barely ever done any unilateral work. I find it drags out the sets and it's hard to focus on the second limb after exhausting yourself on the first. I also just find it boring and I'm much more focused on the big 3 and getting strong. Good. Well done. Being as symmetrical as possible for aesthetic reasons are low on my list. So for someone mostly interested in getting stronger, how important is unilateral work? If I don't want to swap some sweet barbell movements for the unilateral versions, so far injury-free. And there was a follow-up reply. Somebody else also chimed in and said that I'm in the same boat, and she mentioned a hip shift. Now, firstly, let's talk about the follow-up first. The person that mentioned the hip shift. I think this is catching up. I have a hip shift in my squat when working close to my 1 rep max. Now, I don't believe we can necessarily say that's the result of neglecting unilateral work. I don't think the causation is there necessarily. You may just have some sort of structural deficiency. So unless you know what that is, I wouldn't say this is directly the result of ignoring unilateral work. So I'm not sure it follows. I'm not saying don't do unilateral work. I'm just saying, perhaps we're jumping the gun a little bit here. We're a bit premature. I would say to you, perhaps try some unilateral work, see if that starts to fix the problem. But ultimately, what you're going to need to do is you're going to need to take the weight back down to where you don't get any hip shift, and then drill that weight over and over and over, and then get stronger from there. The reason that you're breaking apart on a 1 rep max attempt is, well, that's what happens. It's a max attempt. Okay, everyone does. Everyone has something. Some people lean forward, some people lean to the side. It's just what happens. It's our natural biology. We can't escape that on a 1 rep max. We're never really going to have perfect looking 1 rep maxes, true 1 rep maxes. It is the way it is. So, I wouldn't jump the gun so quickly on saying my unilateral work is going to fix my hip shift. What's going to fix your hip shift is dropping the weight back down, fix your hip shift, and then move it back up without hip shift. Simple. And that means you get more specific work on the actual lift, more drilling of the lift, and also stop doing lifts which highlight your hip shift, because you're just drilling that into your body to get stronger in that position. But now, going back to the main question, which is unilateral work, I'm not a massive fan of it, to be honest. I'm not a huge fan of it. I think if you are going to do it, if you want to experiment with it, if you think it's worthwhile for you, I don't. Okay, I don't generally tend to do it. I do have, my left side is weaker, not actually weaker, but my left side is not as well developed as my right side. It's still as strong. So if I was to do some unilateral work, I would say do a training cycle where I purposely keep maintenance volume on everything, and then I add in additional work, which is just as hard on the unilateral stuff. So I would go to failure on it, add volume to it, all that kind of good stuff. That's how I would do it. Do I think it's massively worth doing? Not really. Everyone has some inequalities. Everyone has some, unevenness in their body. Like if you look at guys have one testicle which is lower than the other, right? Up until I didn't know this while I was powerlifting, but after I retired from powerlifting, when I was talking to a physio and she was checking me out, I knew that I had my left leg was slightly longer than my right leg. We all have these weird things. We all have imperfections. Perfect people are what defines beauty, right? We all have these imperfections. Some women have one breast which is larger than another. It's very, very normal. So it's very normal to have unevenness, due to neural connections, due to the way you're built, all that kind of stuff. It's very, very normal. It's not as visible for you as a person unless you're hyper focusing on it than it is for other people. Other people tend not to notice things that much. So do I think it's worthwhile? If it bothers you, only you can answer that question really. If it bothers you, then sure. Try it for a duration of 6 weeks. Do it the way I've suggested it, and then see if there's any improvement. If there is, great. If there's not, well, maybe it's not to be. So maybe it's something not to worry about. But yeah, I generally don't bother with it. All right. Moving on to Martin. I'd really enjoy a video about how to deal with an injury correctly in regards to weightlifting, both mental and physical. Okay, it's a good question. I'll answer it quickly now, and then I might do a video on it as well. But some of the best advice that I've ever heard regarding injury management is that the exercise which hurts you will be the exercise which heals you in therapeutic doses. Okay, so let's say you tore a hamstring on a deadlift. what's going to help you rehabilitate that movement is starting back, as soon as the swelling is reduced, starting back on a deadlift variation, maybe the Romanian deadlift, doing it for high reps with a very, very lightweight, just a bar or even a broomstick if you can't handle the bar. Every single day. This is the classic Bill Starr method of rehabilitation. Every single day and slowly building up over time. Once the initial inflammation and all that kind of stuff is gone, and once you got the clear from your doctor that you can go back to the gym and start to rehabilitate, you need to start to begin to impose a stress on the body for it to respond by healing. If you don't do that, it will never heal. Also, what is quite useful that I find in my experience is massage to break up scar tissue. Scar tissue it's sort of like when you have an injury, scar tissue forms over the muscle, and it's kind of like a Band-Aid solution. It's sort of like a plaster, like a mesh. It's hard, but it's kind of brittle. And as soon as that muscle gets tensed and stretched, it'll snap, and the mesh will break apart again. And you're like, oh crap, I've injured myself again. You've not injured yourself again. You just broken apart scar tissue. So regular massage to break up that scar tissue is useful, so your muscles can actually heal properly without the sort of scab on top, which is scar tissue. All right. So those are my 2 big tips. But yeah, I think I'll make a full video on that at some point. All right. What rest times do you recommend for compound movements, 6 to 10 reps, and isolation exercises, 10 to 15 reps? Okay, we've got a few questions here, so I'll start with that. Rest times in general, I would say, if you want specifics, I would say at least 2 minutes for compound movements. We know now from the research that longer rest periods tend to be better, but we also know from the research, the latest research, there's not that much difference between 2 minutes and 3 minutes. So if I was in a rush for time, I would probably do about 2 minutes. If I had a lot of time and I was doing a very low volume workout, then I tend to take longer. Isolation stuff, I don't tend to take as long. It's more like 1 to 2 minutes, just because, yeah, I mean, it's still going to progress. And I'm getting my heavy work in the compound. The compounds is what I'm mostly interested in. If I get bigger on those, I'll be bigger everywhere. So yeah, minimum 2 minutes and up from there. Also, this kind of varies on your fitness levels as well. I mean, if you are like, I would always take more rest when I was bigger and I was lifting heavier, because my fitness just wasn't that great. Like nowadays, my fitness is actually pretty decent. So I can recover within 2 minutes pretty easily. And also nowadays, I tend to do much more isolation stuff. Like even though I'm doing compounds, I'm doing more like machine compounds and dumbbells and lighter barbell stuff. So whereas previously it was all squat, bench, and deadlift. So yeah, I think the heavier you are and the heavier you're lifting, possibly the more rest you need as standard as well. So bear that in mind. If you're a small female, for example, probably not going to need that much rest. Comparison between pyramid and reverse pyramid training, I think that would require a whole video. All I will say on that is pyramid training is probably safer. In fact, I'll almost definitely say it's safer, because if you start with something like a 15 rep set, like that's light, like no one's getting injured on a 15 rep set, and it's heavy enough, it's enough reps with enough intensity that you can actually get pretty warm as well. So I did do some pyramid training earlier on this year, and I found it very, very good for injury prevention. Like it was a great way to get a lot of work in. I think sometimes what happens is when people go to like sets across, they're in a rush to get to the set across, or like the main set. And so they rush their warm-ups and they end up getting hurt, or they're going to get like little niggles. Same with the reverse pyramid. If you're doing that, just be careful to warm up. At the end of the day, it's all progression. You know, it's all progression. Whatever allows you to focus on your sets, that's the main thing. Now, if you can only focus on, say, 2 main sets, and that's a lot of people, top set, back off set, then boom, do that. If you have the physical, neural capability to focus on more sets, then great, do more sets, you know. But it's kind of like, I don't mean to be dismissive. It's not saying it doesn't matter, because obviously volume matters to an extent. I mean, that's a different rant that I could go on. But the only thing that matters, this is not just for So asking the question, this is for everyone. The only thing that actually matters is getting stronger over time. The type of routine you use to get stronger over time is a lever. It's pulling a lever. It is not the destination. The destination is progressive overload from week to week or month to month, whatever. How you accomplish that, you use the different factors, like the different routines, the different intensities, the different volume settings. You use all those as levers to get you to where you want to be week to week. You do that to impose the stress you need. Like if you've been swimming along nicely and you have been doing 5 sets, This is actually very common. I know people who do this. 5 or 6 sets per muscle group per week, and they progress. Great. You know, the research might tell you to use 45 sets, but you're there doing 45 sets or 6 sets. Let's say you get your bench press to 3 plates aside using 6 sets. Do you think your muscles are going to be any less big than somebody who gets there using 45 sets? Of course not. You know, you're still going to have a big check. You're going to have just the same development, because the end goal, the progressive resistance is the end goal. The routines, the volume is the lever. That's what it is. So just bear that in mind. So your stance on upper lower split training 4 days a week versus 6 days a week, same weekly volume. I don't mind. 4 to 6 is fine. I generally go with 4 just because it's quite nice for the shoulder girdle to have a couple of days off. Like if you're doing 6 days a week, and let's assume you're also doing deadlifts on lower body day, that's quite a lot of shoulder girdle work. In fact, your shoulder girdle is getting hit 6 days a week. That's probably going to be too much for most people. I mean, even doing something like a upper lower might be too much for some people if your volume is crazy high. It's not an excuse to go crazy on the volume. So I would always say progress while with the least you're able to, and with what allows you to progress without injuring yourself consistently or hurting yourself. Because it's like if your elbow is always hurting, you've got to address that. Okay, you're never going to get super strong if your joints are always hurting. So, yeah, I think, you know, if you can split it up and your shoulder girdle is okay, it's okay being hit 3 times a week or 6 times, then yeah, cool, go for it. But you said here that you feel that the sessions are too long on 2 times a week weekly frequency. Fair enough. That's okay. I mean, maybe try some kind of modified bro split. I mean, you saw the way I split up my workout. I do it sort of chest and bis, legs, delts and tris, and back. That's quite nice because once you've hit a body part, you're warmed up for the rest of it. So you can just continuously run through a lot of work, and it can cut down your time in the gym because you do less warm-up sets for every individual part. In an upper body, obviously, you have to warm everything up. So maybe consider that if time's of the essence. I don't think... Well, I know that frequency doesn't really matter that much. It's more about just getting stronger. You know, the only thing that changes a little bit with a bro split or any kind of split routine is you're much more concerned with your strength progression on the first exercise of the day rather than exercise 2 or 3 or 4. Makes sense, right? Like if you're doing a back twice a week, you can be 100% focused on progression in the first and maybe second exercise on both days. Okay. If you're doing back once a week and you've got 4 or 5 exercises, well, by the 4th and 5th exercise, yeah, it's still working you, but you might not be able to get the strength progression unless you're, you know, really progressing really, really well. So yeah, that's the only kind of change in mentality I would accept is, yeah, go with aiming to just moderate your expectations in terms of how many exercises you progress on. That's all. But yeah, I don't see the problem with doing a modified bro split. All right, can you talk about set amount requirements for different people and novice, intermediate, advanced, and how would you progress with a 4-day split, back, chest, legs, arms, shoulders, in terms of sets per muscle group per week? Okay. All right, now I'm probably not going to give you the answer you want to hear, and I guess I'm going to go off on a little bit of a rant, maybe. I don't like all the volume discussions necessarily, because I think they are one more thing which has diluted people's focus on what matters, which is progressive overload and getting stronger. Because when setting up a routine, people are more focused now on volume than they are on how they're going to progress, what their progression scheme is. And that's what kind of annoys me a little bit sometimes, because it's a very small part. Like whether you do 10 sets or 20 sets a week or even 8 sets a week, it's a very small part of the program. Like what actually matters is adding weight to the bar. Now, you only increase or decrease the volume if you are unable to add weight to the bar. And let me just explain that. So let's say you do, let's pick right down the middle. Let's pick 10 sets a week, okay? Let's say you're doing 10 sets a week for chest and for pressing and for whatever, right? And let's say you're not progressing. So you start with 10 sets, you're not progressing. Now, there are 2 eventualities. One, you're not progressing and you are not sore at all. In fact, you feel great. Your recovery is fantastic. Like, this is easy. That means you need more work or you need to work harder. Okay? Because you didn't progress and your muscles are like, meh, this is nothing. This is fine. Second eventuality is you're doing 10 sets per week and you're battered. Like your shoulders hurting, your elbows hurting, and you're not progressing. You need less work. That's why volume is important. That's how you should use volume. That is the way you should use it to modulate what you do. There are no, the set requirements are so individual for everyone. We need to move away from these standards that have been set out. Admittedly, I don't think Mike meant it to ever be this way, but he does certainly say 10 to 20 a lot. But those are suggestions for allowing you to get more weight on the bar. They're not suggestions for hypertrophy. I almost feel like some people think if they do 10 sets per week, or 10 to 20 sets per week, they're going to grow. It's no. You're only going to grow if you can demonstrate you got better from week 1 to week 2. So if you added weight to the bar or added reps to your sets, congrats. What you did the previous week was enough. That was enough volume. But it's kind of like the analogy that I would give you is volume is just like turning up to school. I'm here, give me my grades. And you just sat at the back of the class staring through the window. That is the intensity. Your work effort in class is your intensity. Yeah. So you can have 100% attendance. You can have the right, perfect, magical frequency, right? And all that kind of stuff. But when you get into class, if you're just staring out the window, then you're not passing the exam at the end of the year. So what I mean is use volume as a lever for your training. There are no, I will disagree. I'll publicly out and out disagree with what Mike and co says about that. There are no generic set and rep recommendations. There are none. You have to find what amount of the work allows you to progressively put weight on the bar. And I would rather people do that, much rather people do that than have this situation where it's okay, I'm going to just start with, this ideal amount. I would rather you just start. And start in the middle, go for it. Start 10 and go from there. You ask me about intermediate and advanced. Well, at that point, it's you should have known what worked for you to get to that point. How much volume did you do? Pay attention to that and move forward from there. This is where I think people kind of lose their heads. Let's say you're an intermediate guy. Well, what work have you been doing before you read Mike Israetel's? Sorry if this has been a bit of a rant. I don't mean to be, I'm not telling you off, but it just annoys me because people will read all this stuff from these authors and then it'll be okay, everything that they've done up to that point will just be clean, forgotten out the window. And they're okay, right, now I've got to do these sets and I've got to make this work because this is it. What about your best training tool is your training diary, is data on you. That is your best training diary. So having said that, I guess I will say this. I think in general, lower volume for beginners, they can get away with more, but they don't have to do it. The highest volume is probably going to be in intermediate stage, just because you need a lot of work to see gains, but you're also not that strong. And then as you get more advanced, volume tends to slow down because each set is just so ridiculously disruptive. And that's loosely what happens in my experience. So at the most advanced stage, you just can't stand very much. So this is why you typically see IFBB pros either ramping up to one top set or doing the top set back off set approach. It amounts to very little volume because the poundages they use are just insane. So they can impose a massive stress on the body. Also, IFBB pros tend to be very heavy boned, so they can withstand the stresses of heavy training to allow them to stress their muscles more. But for the regular person who's a bit more intermediate, they'll probably respond to higher volume. Now, in terms of how to progress with a 4-day split, I would just say I'm not actually a massive fan of volume progressions anymore. I don't tend to do those very often. I don't find them that useful. What I do find useful, I still find useful, is deloads. So I'd still do those. But they're more useful within the context of there being a set 6 weeks where you can evaluate. So, I wouldn't raise weekly volume week by week. I just don't. I don't support that. And no, I'm not going to say I don't support that. The science doesn't really support that right now. It's not. My point of view is with the science on this is that it doesn't support weekly set volume increases. It does support volume increases over the course of a lifetime, but weekly set volume increases are not supported by the research at all. There was one study done by Israetel and Feather which supports that. Well, I'll leave you to make your mind up about what I think about that. Right. So next question by Ricardo. Ricardo is an OG fan of the channel, so thank you. How would you peak after utilizing your Tactician program for several months? So yeah, Ricardo was also one of the first guys to buy my Tactician program, which is a powerlifting split, and it's how I programmed my powerlifting when I first started powerlifting. It's basically a full body about 3 times a week with an optional accessory day. Now, in terms of how I would peak it, what I would do is I would begin, you know how you've got singles, over warm-ups, and then you've got your back-off sets. At a certain point when you're looking to peak, I would begin to drop off your back-off sets and just do your singles. So for a course of about 2 weeks, you would go in and just do your singles. Now, the first day you do them on a Monday, you might go, for a good single, and maybe go for like 1 single, and maybe even as much as 3 singles on that day. So like 3 singles for the squat, 3 for the bench, 3 for the deadlift. That will get your body used to doing them, okay? And if you do 3 singles across with the same weight, it's a reasonable weight, that should get your body accustomed to doing them. The next session, you will probably be better, okay? Because it allows you to express your strength a bit more. You will probably be able to add a bit of weight to the bar. Now, the session after that, you might come in, you might feel terrible. That's it, you're done. So that's how I peak it. Move to singles and no back-offs and heavier singles for a few sessions, and basically you'll know when your limit is. So first session, go in 3 singles with a 95 to 98% weight, and then next session, maybe on a Friday, go in, and I would still do the light session on a Wednesday, so do some speed work or just go in and pump the muscles up a bit like active recovery. And then on Friday, go in and then go for another max. If you get to 95% and it feels easy, go for more. Go for a PR, that kind of stuff. And that's kind of when you'll start to know, okay, have I got it in me today? If you've got it, then take it. If you go for PR, great. If it rolls around to next Monday again and you think, okay, I still feel pretty good, I could go again, go to the gym, see how it feels, and give it a try. See how that feels. If you get up to 90% and your joints feel terrible, you're done. Have a drink, say goodbye to the reception, and that's it. Go home. Congratulations, you've done a nice little peak, which has given you some time to get accustomed to the heavier weights, and you know where you're at. Then take a week deload and start again. Okay, question by Ahmed. Thoughts on recomp? Ahmed, I've got a whole video on recomp, so go and check that out. It's about half an hour video, so it's very useful. Right. Next is, oops, I've lost. 1 second, here we go. Sorry, pressed something when I was looking at it, I've lost it. Okay, we're back. All right, does stretching really matter? And what's a good routine to do so? All right. One thing I'll say about stretching is it's a little bit misunderstood. Like, not every apparent flexibility problem is going to be cured by stretching, okay? So let's say a very common one is people not being able to get depth on squats. That's not always a flexibility issue. Many times, that's a strength issue. So if you don't have the necessary quad strength, you're not going to be able to go deep in a squat. I know that sounds weird because a lot of people say you need more posterior if you end up good morning a squat. That's completely false. Completely false. If you end up good morning a squat, it's not because of a lack of flexibility. It's because your quads are underpowered. They are too weak. Okay? Because they're a weak area, so your body is compensating with its stronger muscle group, which is the backside of the body. Like, I don't know why people say, there are large YouTube fitness influencers who say if you back up a squat, that's because your quads are too strong. That's absolutely ridiculous. Like, when in your physique ever does a weak body part become the focus for an exercise? Oh, I'm doing bicep curls. You're not. My biceps are the weak point. That's why they're doing all the work. Yeah. No, what often happens is when biceps are the weak point, people tend to swing a lot more. They tend to get their front delts into it. Their forearms grow more, all that kind of stuff. Like, or let's say another example. Oh God, my chest is so weak. Whenever I do bench presses, I feel it in my chest all the time. Really? Usually when people's bench presses are weak, they become more shoulder dominant and more chest, more tricep dominant. So I don't know why people get this idea that when you are failing on an exercise, it's because you are stronger in that body part. If you lean forward on a squat, it's because your stronger muscle groups are taking over, ergo, not your quads. So there are many reasons why you may be going. It might not be flexibility. So anyway, it could be a strength issue. My point is that it could be flexibility, it could be strength. Excuse me. So I would say it's situationally useful. Like if you need to get deeper on a squat, try the stretching, but you're also just going to need to practice with the right groove. It's a rare person that if I say, they can't do the squat properly, for example, it's a rare person who can't do it, say, lying the side on in bed. They can't get their angles in that position, their legs and joints in that position. So they've got the flexibility, it's just they can't do it under load, which suggests to me that it's actually a strength problem, not a flexibility problem. So yeah, I'd say if you think it is your flexibility, try and do it. If your flexibility is impairing your ability to do the lifts, then that's when it's a problem for me. Now, if you're stretching just for enjoyment of stretching, then that's a different matter altogether. But flexibility is in general an issue when it impairs your ability to do the lifts properly. That's when it's mostly an issue. Okay. Now, if you can get around that, great. Just try stretching, and maybe even stretching before you work out, before you do the training, because that will open up your body and allow you to do the lift properly. I would rather you do the lift properly and use less weight than stretch afterwards and your lift look like crap, because then all you're doing is drilling in the technique of bad technique. You're drilling in the bad technique. So just to summarize that, because I think I wasn't very that clear on that. Basically, with regards to stretching, it's useful if it's impairing your ability to do the lifts. It's not as useful if you can do the lifts okay. And also, a lot of time fixing the lifts is just getting the positions right and practice. If the stretching is preventing you from actually doing the lift correctly, which often happens in a squat, it may be an idea to stretch before the workout, because then that might allow you to get into the right position, which then allows you to drill the lift correctly. I would rather you do that with a lighter weight than lift heavy and just lift like crap, because that will reinforce poor form. So yeah, hopefully that answers your question. Right, folks, I am going to call it there for part 1 because it's getting quite long, and I will look at recording a second part and putting up later in the week. All right, speak soon.